So I should say that Trevor is the biggest inspiration behind this whole thing. And that is, in my opinion, it's very rare and very good when the taste for life coincides with the taste for science. And Trevor got me going in STS when I first read the book How Users Matter. And then I learned about the mini-mog exercises, which was a surprise. But today he will speak about something else which very closely hinges to the work which we have been doing in our studies of infrastructure, so I'm more interested to be finally master-classed.
Okay.
Okay.
Well, thank you very much for the invitation and for organizing the meeting. It's been incredible to see so many people interested in this area of science and technology studies. And I'm also a little uncertain what format we need for a masterclass, because this is only the second masterclass I've ever done. And you usually think of masterclass as being associated with music. And I have another whole identity. I play electronic music. And just this last year I did a masterclass in electronic music with a guy called Future Man from Bella Fleck and the Flecktones. And this is an amazing guy and a brilliant musician who has his own interface, drum interface, and he's got long dreadlocks, and we sat together and talking about the way we made electronic music and then did demos of it. So this is but I think the key thing for me for a master class is to keep it interactive. So I want to make certain we have plenty of time for discussion and questions. And also I think this topic of, since there's work on infrastructure, it's gone on, Olga and Oleg have done studies of infrastructure, other people here, that we may want to leave space as well for thinking about how we can take this forward in terms of research here in Petersburg and in the Russian STS. So that would be ideal. So let me also, yeah.
Let us expand the slides to the whole screen.
Yeah, could you do this for me, please? Yeah.
Sure.
My incompetence with, there, yeah, there.
You see the cursor?
There,
right.
there, yeah, yeah,
good.
thank you, yeah. What I'll eventually get to talk about is a paper I've written about putting the non-humans to rights and making infrastructure visible, which if you're actually interested in, I don't know, will you have read it already? It's published in the Cambridge Journal of Economics.
In my class they have read it.
So some of you will have read this paper already, good. Because that's mainly what we'll get to talk about in terms of the particular content. But I just wanted to say a little word, since Steve Woolgar and Andy Pickering talked a little bit about biography, I'll just say a little bit about biography, about how I tend to work in science studies and also in sociology. I realize that some of the papers I write are not particularly necessarily in science studies. So my identity is as an academic who writes in science studies but also writes pieces of work that are outside science studies. I consider I have an identity, and we all do this identity work as a sociologist. And I'm interested in sociology of markets, which is not necessarily a particularly science studies approach. I was informed by ideas more from Harvey Sachs and conversation analysis, and I've written about that on markets, a certain style of market trade. It's not particularly science studies. And my style of working throughout my career has been, I would say it sounds like I'm a scientist. I actually feel I'm curiosity driven. I often encounter some phenomena in my life and I get intrigued by it and curious about it, and I consider it a real privilege. I sometimes can't believe it that then I'm allowed to study it in more detail and sometimes get funded for it. So the very first major STS study I did was of this solar neutrino experiment, which eventually led to a Nobel Prize for the scientist involved, Ray Davis. But I was introduced to that experiment when I was sitting in an incredibly boring physics class at Imperial College where I did my undergraduate education. And I remember this professor, Professor Jim Ring, who was a professor of astronomy, put up a picture of this solar neutrino experiment, which was carried out in a deep mine shaft, the deepest mine in America, in Leeds, South Dakota, in the middle of nowhere, and was a huge tank of cleaning fluid. That's essentially what the experiment was. And I remember thinking, God, that's one of the most interesting experiments I've heard about in physics for a long time. And who would know that, 4 years after that, I was actually privileged to be doing for my PhD, a sociological study of that experiment, the experimentalists, the theoreticians involved. That experiment at the time had come out with an answer for the number of these particles coming from the sun. There are billions of them, according to physics, passing through us every second. That was too small. And it was just a curiosity that here in this gigantic tank of cleaning fluid, they're just finding a very small number of these neutrinos that really drove me to that study. So it was for me in life, it's been a curiosity thing. I'm curious often about phenomena. So I mentioned yesterday I was doing a study of this ranking of Amazon.com products, and I'm sort of curious as to how does this ranking system work. And I know it sounds a bit boring, but it's a really old-fashioned scientific way of working. That I get curious about phenomena, and I like it to be surprised. So we've had lots of talks about reflexivity, especially from Steve Woolgar. And the question I would have had for him, I didn't feel I wanted to ask it because I wasn't a student in the masterclass, would be, if you already got this reflexive approach, what is the surprise in the world? Because he's always saying, think other, but that isn't a surprise in a way, so it becomes like a formula in its own right. So for me, the actual surprise comes when I get familiar with something, examining it. I use kind of realist methods. I do things like interviewing with people, ethnography, and I'm surprised what I find in the world. So when I found that the main group of people, one of the biggest groups of people who are writing product reviews were retirees, old people, that was a surprise for me. And so it's little things like that that kind of excite me. It's the counterintuitive, surprise nature of what we turn up. And I like to be, and this is where I think I tie in with Andy Pickering. I see Andy's project, and it's great that someone in science studies can go more into what I think almost like a philosophy. That's how I almost see what Andy's doing these days. And I like to be immersed in the world as well. And I think his kind of, I'm appealed by I find it appealing, his description of this world, of sort of a world of becoming and flux and all that. And I like to be immersed in the world, but I'm always thinking when I'm out in this world of what I'm curious about in it and what can I study in it and what can I bring back to the academic community. That's, I guess, my sort of project. So I haven't, over time, developed one consistent academic profile. That's what I think I'm trying to get. I was aware of this recently because there's a guy from Italy who's been visiting Cornell for the last 3 months. Simone Tossini is his name. And he's decided to write a book about me in Italian. And it's about my approach. And I realized that he was sort of, his way of framing it was to say, social construction of technology. This is a really important approach, and you've helped develop it. And Latour's out there with his approach, and he's got far more. I actually think your approach is better, and why don't you ever write a book just by yourself on the social construction of technology? And he wanted me to do that. And maybe I will do that one day, but that hasn't been my way of working. And I think it could have turned out to be a boring book, so I may not do that. I don't know. But I've been associated with this social construction of technology approach. But I'd hate you to think that, oh yeah, he's sort of sitting away developing social construction of technology. Every study he does is social construction of technology. Because life is much more interesting than that. So this paper that I've written about the infrastructure of the non-humans gave me a chance to come back to the social construction of technology. And if you want the sort of theorist who's been pushing the social construction of technology in a more systematic way throughout his career, that's my co-author, Wiebe Baker. I mean, he's written this magnificent book on bikes, Bakelite and something else, light bulbs, where he compares, some of you are asking about comparison, he systematically compares these different case studies and really develops the framework of social construction of technology. But now I come to the work on infrastructure, and this relates again to how I work as an academic. So I'm living in Ithaca, where Cornell University is, upstate New York, and I have a house there. And in this little community where I live, it's a village called Forest Home. We have something called a Forest Home Improvement Association. And when you see how beautiful this place is, you'll scarcely think it's a real indulgence that it could be improved at all, because it's actually a beautiful place. In fact, there is Welcome to the Forest Home Community in Ifikanu. There's our web page. And it sort of looks pretty nice, doesn't it? So there's a bunch of houses around a river, this Fall Creek, and there's probably about 80 houses, a very small community. We're right next to Cornell University, and you can go to the website if you want to find out more about it. And we have this democratic organization where we as a community elect representatives, and it's called the Forest Home Community Association. We do social work in the community, like organize parties, introduce new people into the community, but we also do politics in terms of how to protect our community, how to make it better. And this is where I get to this project of infrastructure. So it so happened that I was involved in this community. I went to the meetings and they asked me to stand for election. And I eventually got elected into this community. First I was vice president, then I became president, and then I've done my presidency. When I wrote this paper, I was still president, and I'm now something called a street captain. It sounds like a military organization. I'm street captain for our little street, Crest Lane. I have to distribute leaflets and things about our latest policies. But what for me was so interesting about that is I didn't think at first I was going to be studying my own community and my own involvement, was that the sort of emails I started to get and the sort of political projects that this community undertook, I realized could be thought of as STS projects. So if you're interested in human-animal relationships, I have a huge box of email about the problem of deer in Forest Home. Deer, these things with antlers on. Now, people used to live in nice balance with deer, but of course in Forest Home community is Cornell professors and we're all kind to animals, many of us vegetarians. So nobody is shooting enough deer anymore. And so the deer are out of control. And this is a shock.
You mean like squirrels?
Yeah, they are really out of control.
Те, кто был в Гарварде, знают, что там громадное количество белок, невозможно. Оказывается, и олени тоже. Okay, sorry.
And it's kind of shocking, because you start off, as a family, your attitude is, if you've got children, you see these little Bambis, you think, oh, how sweet these deer are in our gardens, how lovely. And then, you start to have certain experiences that turn you against the deer. Like if you're a gardener, I come from England, so I like to have a garden. So I planted my garden, and my favorite flower is tulips. And I tell you, I've learned that the favorite food of deer is tulips. So I had no tulips, but daffodils, by the way, it turns out they will not touch daffodils. Apparently daffodils are deadly poisonous to most animals. So we have daffodils but no tulips. But you have basically to put huge fences up to protect whatever you want to grow that you like from the deer. Anything vegetables has to be totally protected, otherwise you'll lose it. And then these deer start creating problems for, Steve Wilgar said one of the most interesting things that he observed in Petersburg is traffic. I bet you don't have this accident. Our most common accident is hitting deer. And this is it's a real trauma, and it kills the deer usually. But what's worse is that young drivers, 18-year-old drivers, tend to like the deer and try and avoid them. That's a huge mistake, because if you avoid the deer, your car will swerve off and you'll hit a tree and be killed. So deer-human interaction. So anyway, this is a way of getting into what and by the way, I have a whole new box of email about ducks recently as well, if anyone's interested in ducks. But this is a way of engaging with infrastructural issues. And one of the biggest issues facing our little community is that we are near this gigantic university, Cornell University, which has a huge number, the budget of Cornell is bigger than that of most small states. It's unbelievable organization, number of people. And if you're in a small little community near this big thing, you've got lots of people driving through your little community very fast. And so our community, this looks like peaceful, but it's destroyed at certain times of the day by cars rushing through. Okay, and no one likes cars, it's dangerous for children. We have the deer problem as well. Oh, there you are. This just, I've just shown you a few pictures of it. Those are the officers and street captains. Look how beautiful our houses are. It's all ideal. There's me. Oh God, there's my address on the internet. I'm the street captain there. This guy Drew is a friend of mine. He's the street captain for Fairway Drive. Okay, so that's the forest home. So my involvement with infrastructure is in all sorts of ways. But one of the biggest has been for trying to slow down the cars that come through town, through our little hamlet. So we call it traffic calming. So we've been doing this in our community. It's been a long, long process. First of all, studies involving getting consultants as to thinking of the best way of slowing down traffic. And it's that which led to the paper, because if you know anything about traffic calming, and if you've read the work of Bruno Latour, you'll know that Bruno Latour has this whole thing about the speed bumps, the sleeping policeman idea. I think you're all familiar with that. And I've always been intrigued. I've known Bruno Latour, like Andy has, my whole career. I can remember when Bruno Latour came and used to sleep on the couch in my room. And he was doing what we all thought was controversy research, and we didn't realize he was going to take this in a completely different direction of actor network theory back then. He presented it as that he was doing a controversy study. And so I've been intrigued and fascinated by his work, but also a critic of it. And this symmetry of Calon and Latour's between the human and the non-human is something that I didn't write something critical of it until this one article I've written in this Cambridge Journal of Economics. But I always rejected that symmetry in teaching. I didn't think it made sense to talk about humans and non-humans and apply the same analytical vocabulary to them. And I think it came from me initially as just a sociological sensibility, that my main data as a sociologist came from interviewing humans. And if you interview tables or deer, you don't get such interesting responses. So it was actually a sort of a methodological thing that I objected to. And making the non-human speak for you is an interesting issue in its own right. So the paper goes through different examples that I ran into as working. It's like an ethnography of my own involvement in the Forest Home Improvement Association. And I wrote the paper. You'll know one of the great things about Bruno Latour's writing, especially if you read the chapter on the speed bumps and the seat belts. I think it was published in 1992. It's his style of writing, where he's sort of in this car with his kid, and he's got all the, and he's talking about his house in the countryside. And so I tried to sort of mimic his style of writing in this paper. So I do think the literary technology here of what I used is important as well. So I start off by saying I'm this humble president. So I'll just read you a little bit about, I'll just read, if you bear with me, just so you get the flavor. I won't read much from it because I know it'll be absolutely tedious in a master, but I just want to read you a bit. So I start off by saying I was once mistaken for a rabbi, right? So in this part of the paper I say, let me tell you about the rabbi. At a recent meeting of the Ithaca Town Planning Committee, which I was attending for only the second time, I was asked whether I was the rabbi from Cornell University the committee was expecting. Alas, my rabbi credentials are even less impressive than my philosophical ones. But then the real rabbi appeared, and what he came to tell us about was extraordinary. And this was the first little case study in the paper. I'm sorry, I'm interrupting now. This is not my language. This is me breaking frame, as Goffman would say. Back to the paper. He wanted our town to be surrounded by an invisible wall, a very special form of wall known in Jewish law as an eruv, the Hebrew word for mixing or blending. Oh, those are our calming updates. Here we go, yeah. We'll get to this guy. This is an eruv installer, okay? An eruv surrounds a space with a series of symbolic gates. If anyone here is Jewish, you'll know about it, as to a temple, enables a blending of the public and private space within. Once in existence, this so-called invisible wall gives the space within it special religious significance, a form of virtual temple, and allows Orthodox Jewish religious observances to be carried out in an easier way. It would permit an Orthodox Jew, say, to take property from his home that would not normally be allowed on the Sabbath. The example the rabbi gave, well chosen to appeal to our better nature, no doubt, was of someone in a wheelchair who could, with the help of the Erev, be permitted to leave the house on the Sabbath, while strict observance would not allow this. And Cornell University has many Orthodox Jews living, as our students, living in Ithaca. So we would benefit from having this Erev constructed around Cornell. It would help the Orthodox Jews in the community. And it turns out this is something that's been lobbied for in all sorts of places, and they have ways of installing an Erev that turns out to be based upon the infrastructure that's in place already. Because basically, an Erev is, you have to construct like links, the columns of a temple and lines between them. And it turns out that the telegraph poles are perfect for constructing an Erev. And so they have a special companies, Orthodox Jewish Erev fitters. This guy here is one such person who will work in conjunction with the power line cables to establish Erevs. And if you go online, you'll see these Erevs have been constructed in many different parts of the world. Many different cities in America are lobbying to have Erevs put up around them. So this was the first case study. And it turns out, by the way, it's non-trivial. You can't, the poles are not lined up precisely according to Jewish law. So you have to be retrofitted with a sort of a plastic column that has to be fitted to them. And they measure this with this amazing technology of lasers to get this exactly right. And it's a really interesting technology because it's kind of, it builds on an infrastructure. This is one of the key points about infrastructure. Susan Lee Starr has written a very nice paper that's out there on the anthropology of infrastructure. And she points out that much infrastructure builds upon what's there already. So this is a nice example because the Erev infrastructure is being built upon the pre-existing telegraph thing. It has to be modified and checked with these laser things, laser devices. And so what I do in the paper, I analyze this. In social construction technology, we talk about social groups, and I say the rabbi had done his work in advance. He'd lined up the two key social groups to carry the plan forward, which are the power utilities, something called formerly AT&T, Verizon, and NICEC. And he got these contractors ready to do it. And now he needed the permission of the town of Ithaca, where I was sitting at the meeting, to do this. And in the paper, I go through some of the issues, and one of the issues is that in America there's a strict separation of church and state. This is in American Constitution. So would this religious technology, if we as a secular organization endorsed it, and they wanted us to endorse it, would that be a problem? So that was one of the issues that came up. The town clerk had gone online and had found, even in Silicon Valley, in Palo Alto, there's an Erev, and there'd been an argument about it. And then the issue became, okay, we might allow, it's kind of invisible, so ordinary people wouldn't see it, so it's interesting, but people who are Orthodox Jews would see it. So it's an interesting technology, because ordinary people wouldn't see it, but what about if they read the minutes became an issue? They would know about it. Would they object? Then what if a less benign religious group wanted to nail crosses to every telephone pole in Ithaca? You can imagine some Christian fundamentalists wanting that. Would we oppose that? So we got into heavy debate about all the implications of this sort of technology. We ended up basically deciding we would let it go ahead. I have a funny bit of the paper here. We decided to go ahead with it, and we had a lawyer we had a lawyer at the meeting, questioned whether the wall would break local signage ordinances. So these are rules about signs. Ithaca has strict rules about signs being posted on telephone poles, and is this a sign or not? It looks like a sign. No, argued the rabbi, it wasn't a sign because it was invisible to most people. The lawyer came back. The definition of sign is something that conveys information. Since the wall will convey information to some people, it could potentially be a sign. So we decided further investigation was required. But in the end, we decided to grant it. Then someone whispered in my ear after the rabbi had left, if God was really omnipotent, he wouldn't be fooled by this fake wall anyway. The last word, as always, was with God. Somebody asked me before this session whether I believed in God. So the last word is with God. Okay.
Can I interrupt you for a second?
Yeah.
So if Cornell has, with all of its professors, has a Jewish ritual Arab wall around it, built out of telegraph poles.
Yeah.
And if Palo Alto has the same,
There's
which
Palo
is
Alto.
the biggest concentration of high-tech people and intellectuals, Skolkovo should have an Arab as well, right?
Absolutely. This might be the very first infrastructure issue you're going to face.
Otherwise, there will be no Jewish creativity on
Yeah.
the spot. And
Absolutely. Yeah. This is the secret of Silicon Valley.
So this about integrated. First make Arab and then Jewish population.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, how to attract foreigners.
Yeah.
First an Arab, then creativity.
Yeah.
Okay, sorry.
No, good, no. Anyway, so this, anyway, well, the point I want to bring across is that you can get interesting if you just follow your nose and, you know, if you get involved in planning committees. These are really interesting places where issues of infrastructure come on. I won't belabor, I use this example to attack. It's nice to have a straw man, and I'd run into the philosopher John Searle at a meeting before I wrote this paper, and John Searle has been working on our field. I think he's got a book out there on social construction of reality. It's some version of that. I can't remember the exact title. But for him, he has the physical side of walls completely separated from their representational role. And I use this example to make the point the two are integrated together. Okay. And it's a point we're very familiar with in science and technology studies. So I use this in the paper to attack John Searle. Okay. Then, moving on. So then, in the rest of the paper, I use another example from the work that we've been doing in our Forest Home community to attack more Bruno Latour's thing of the sleeping policeman example. And the example I use there, I don't think I've got a picture of it, and we're going to get to this in the middle, is something called the cobbled shoulder. Now, one of the issues in our traffic calming was what to do with bicycles, okay? And this turned out to be one of the most contentious issues because we face in our community a real physical constraint that the roads are very narrow. And normally you'd want to have a bicycle path. This would be the enlightened way of doing it, having a bicycle path alongside the road like in, you know, the Netherlands or go to Copenhagen. This is such a beauty. They have traffic, bicycle, lights, everything. This is a wonderful solution to the infrastructure of bicycles. This is not an option for us because there just was not enough space. So the idea became to slow down the traffic enough, and this would be slowed down with a combination of the sleeping policeman of Latour plus signs saying this is a historic hamlet you're entering, and so a version of history would be constructed which we thought might slow people down. But we weren't certain that the signification of the signs would be strong enough. So we actually had this debate about whether the speed bumps would work better. And it's interesting to see the sorts of arguments that came forward. I learned a lot about speed bumps, and sound is a very interesting thing. One of the biggest objections to speed bump is the noise they make. When the cars hit the speed bump, you get a new sound. So sound pollution from speed bumps became a really interesting issue. But on the bicycle, the solution became, what we're going to do is we're going to slow down the cars, and then the bicyclist will ride in the traffic with the cars, and the cars will be slowed down. It'll be safe for bicyclists to ride there. But the problem was that the bicyclists, I mean, if you're on a bike, you tend to think, God, that's really risky. I'm going to ride on the side of the road. It's the sensible place to be rather than in the middle. So to prevent this, the people who advocated this way of dealing with it came up with the cobbled shoulder, which was a special form of texturing along the side that would give bicyclists a really rough ride and force them into the road. And this was the single most contentious point of the plan, because the bicyclists said, basically, you want to use us as speed bumps to slow down traffic, and we're not having this. And so we got into this huge debate over the forcing aspect of this cobble, okay, and whether it was a good thing or a bad thing, right in the politics of our community. So I want to locate myself in the politics here as well, because that was something, going back to Steve Woolgar's presentation. I mean, this isn't a way about the ontology of artifacts. This is a way of approaching them, like things like cobbled things. But what I found dissatisfying about Steve Woolgar's approach is that he wasn't somehow, it seemed to be like a voice from nowhere. He wasn't located in these disputes himself. I mean, there was also the issue of representation. It seemed paradoxically rather a representational analysis that he was doing that Andy brought up. But also, I felt he wasn't kind of located in it. And here I am in the Forest Home community, located in the middle of the ethnography. I just want to stress that point, that I think that does provide an advantage as well. So, getting now to the critique of Latour. Bruno Latour wants to basically argue that humans and non-humans should be treated in the same way. I want to argue that there's a difference between them, and that ultimately, on these sorts of infrastructure decisions, that they're made by humans. The decision is actually made in a political process by humans. So it concerns non-humans, the cobbled shoulder, and where to put it. And there's a political dispute about the workings of these pieces of technology, but ultimately the humans are deciding in this particular context. So my approach, I'm fairly open about it, is more a humanistic type sociology. That these are where the key decisions are made about infrastructure. The infrastructure does affect people. And you can think about this issue of Latour and the cobbled shoulder, and even more. I suddenly realized this with thinking this through, and maybe you can correct me if I'm wrong about it. No one's corrected me. I sent this paper, by the way, to Bruno, and he said, really funny paper, Trevor. I'm going to have my graduate students discuss it. And I was hoping I'd get a response from him, and he never did respond. So I don't know what the graduate student said. But the Latour example of the speed bump, which is a great example, it's something really intuitively appealing about it, is no more, I decided, than the same example of just a bend in the road. Basically, the bend in the road constrains you to go in a particular direction, right? It forces you. Now, you could go straight, but your bicycle, if you're riding a bicycle, will be ruined. But there is an option of going straight. So his example of how, if you like, things are delegated to non-human is everywhere that you just have a bend in the road. Okay, that's one of the arguments I make in the paper. There's nothing so special about this speed bump example. I then have a methodological point about if you want to focus upon the non-humans, you have to decide which non-humans to focus upon. This is a methodological rule I learned from these infrastructure studies, basically, which I'm advocating. And it seems to be just so obvious that I think I said yesterday, or maybe today, there's 1 billion neutrinos that have just gone through me, just in that last second. There are just too many non-humans in the world. There are so many non-humans, while here there are, in this room, 40, 50 humans. So there's a huge asymmetry in the number of non-humans. So if you want to say I'm going to be equivalent to non-humans and humans, you have to deal with this massive difference in numbers and scale. And I have my methodological rule, which is look at how the humans are attending to the non-humans, and then focus on those human decisions. That's the sort of methodological rule that came out of this study. Then I had one more case study in here, which I discussed with some fun, which tries to get at, because Bruno Latour argues that you have a sign, slow down, it's replaced by a non-human, delegated to a non-human. And I thought it'd be fun to have an example that went the other way, where you had a non-human doing something, and it becomes delegated to a sign. And I observed this is my neighbor's fence. I don't know, do you have this technology in St. Petersburg in Russia? This is a technology for controlling dogs. And it's very, very popular in
also for Skolkovo, right?
Yeah, also, you're going to have the dog problem. So this is, you want to have this technology. This is a,
Невидимые заборы, которые ударяют собак
basically,
током, если идет не туда.
you have a wire, you have a company called the Invisible Fence Company that will put a wire around your property. It'll have a small current going through, not enough to give you electric shock, but produce a radio wave, and the dog will have on a collar. And when it crosses, you can't see this, it's below the ground, the dog will get a shock on the collar. And you can, with Pavlovian training, you can soon, the great Russian, you can train your dog not to cross that invisible fence. And it becomes so effective that after a while you can switch off the invisible fence and your dog will believe that he's going to get shocked and will stay within. But, so what happened with my neighbor, he had a wall, the wall went down, you couldn't see anything, but up came, and you see this everywhere, signs. So this is an example. Bruno's original example was a sign slowed down, being replaced by a non-human. Mine's the reverse. So here you have a non-human, a fence, being replaced by the sign, dog contained by invisible fence. And I did a little ethnographic project to ask people what the meaning of this sign was. Because I was trying to show there was an ambiguity always in this representational domain. And for this case, there clearly is. Dog contained, I did this little ethnography as to why this sign was needed. And I got all sorts of different answers. One answer, very common one, was that this was stipulated by the Invisible Fence Company as an advertisement for Invisible Fence to sell more Invisible Fence systems. It's quite an expensive system. It cost you about $500 to install Invisible Fence. Another reason given to me as to why you had to have invisible fence there was because of the signification work that a wall does. A wall indicates the dog might be a threat to you, and it also stops the dog immediately leaping out at you. Without that wall there, you have no way of knowing that you see a massive dog, it could attack you. And if you don't know there's an invisible fence there, you might have a heart attack or run off very fast and have a heart attack. So the sign is doing important work then in just telling you what this technology is going to do. Don't worry, this dog will not attack you. It's being contained by this invisible fence. Okay, so I use that in the paper to try and get at this link between, I guess you could sort of the role that the sign plays in this delegation job and problematize it to problematize Lector. Okay. And then, by the way, I also have a little side swipe in the paper about the turn to ontology in STS. We've heard something about this from Andy and Steve today. And I just re-establish, it's not that I'm saying that ontology, how things are in the world, are not important. Obviously, we're dealing with objects here. But I just reaffirm that there's no ontology without epistemology. And so intentions can only be determined in context. And I say the job of the sociologist of technology is to try and recover that intentionality in a non-human saturated world. We need some sort of methodological guidance as to which non-humans to focus upon. So when the non-humans are contested, such as at planning committees and the like, the participants do a form of this social construction of technology analysis for us, and we can be there as participants and embed yourself in that context. So I think that the role, here's the role of the sociologist or technologist, I say we're the opposite to magicians who make things and people disappear. I think our goal is to make the things and the humans they interact with reappear. And so that the citizens in these planning communities remind us which non-humans we need to focus upon. And in doing this, the mundane politics of infrastructure and how they involve the non-humans are finally put to rights. This is my sort of putting the non-humans to right, pun on the word right here. Putting right and also rights is somehow underlying this. So it's a sort of, I'm using basically this infrastructure as a methodological thing. Originally, that's why I wrote the paper against Lector's way of doing it, active network way of doing it, or problematizing some of their assumptions. But also, I think it opens up avenues, and this is sort of where I want to get your reaction, if we can go to things for the future. It opens up opportunities to study infrastructure. This is one way of doing it. And the problem with infrastructure is that it's largely invisible. So you need to have to think methodologically about ways of making things visible so that we, or audible as well, it's not only visible, I don't want to be dominated by visual, audible as well, so that we as sociologists of technology can study them. And that's the trick. So why don't I stop there, and I mean, I could go on forever and talk about other things, but let's get, I think it'd be interesting to get reactions, and maybe we can start to work towards what would be interesting projects to look at in terms of...
Okay. So questions, suggestions? Svetlana? Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah, I just wanted to say that in terms of how to study the infrastructure, when something is broken, so suddenly you think that something is missing, so you start noticing things.
Sorry, I missed the question. You said again, sir?
It's not a question, it's just a comment on how do we study the infrastructure, how about the methodology of it.
Yeah.
So I'm just thinking when something is broken.
Broken, yeah.
So
That's
suddenly you realize that there was something beforehand.
Yeah. This is where, you know, Olga, is Olga in the room? And Oleg study, yeah. Why don't you, I mean, because one of the great things that came out of their paper, which I read at the previous meeting, was about how in Russia, when things, so many things are broken.
Yeah, you know, I wrote the introduction. It was Olga and Evgenia who were sitting next to each other.
Yeah.
Who wrote this paper on infrastructure.
Okay. Yeah. Well, maybe you should say something, but this is perfect, because when you look at how things don't work, is exactly how you find out.
Well, maybe Evgenia will say something again just later. Maybe Olga.
So it's another methodological way in when things are broken.
So the study which we made has shown that actually infrastructure is very frequently invisible, you're right.
Каким образом мы можем увидеть вот эту невидимую инфраструктуру городскую, когда это происходит?
So how can we notice the city infrastructure? When does it happen?
Наши кейсы показали, что проявление этой инфраструктуры происходит именно в момент пролома.
And our cases have shown definitely it's during the breakdown periods when we notice infrastructure.
И вопрос, который, конечно, возник у нас, в общем-то, может быть, это станет продолжением, исследованием того, во-первых, насколько нам нужно делать всю invisible инфраструктуру visible, потому что получается, как только мы городскую инфраструктуру переводим в статус видимой вещи, это значит, что она ломается и уже нет.
Okay, and to what extent we can transform the status of infrastructure from invisible to being visible, because when it becomes visible, it means it's not infrastructure anymore, because it's noticeable.
Еще вопрос, я просто смотрел, когда презентацию Тревора, интересная ситуация получается, что у нас есть разные невидимые инфраструктуры, есть невидимые инфраструктуры, выраженные какими-то видимыми знаками, например.
And there are two types of invisible infrastructures. There's the one which is actually exemplified or represented by some visible signs. And another one.
И другая – это невидимая инфраструктура, у которой нет никаких внешних проявлений.
And there's also invisible infrastructure which is actually invisible, which doesn't have any outside signs of appearance.
Ну вот как бы с системами городскими, тут, скажем так, мы их, конечно, не замечаем, тут как ситуация вот с обслуживанием еврейского сообщества. То есть, идя по улице, мы видим люки.
So when we walk on the streets, of course, we see canalization. I don't know how it's called.
Yeah, canonization. Yeah.
Canalization.
Using something for something else. You mean
You don't notice, of course, usually the pipes, you know, and sewage, or sewerage. You don't notice that when you walk on the street. I mean, it's.
На самом деле, увеличенная инфраструктура, она в обычной жизни, видимо, очень ограниченном количестве, потому что, по крайней мере...
Не слышно. Не надо быть скромными девушками. Говорите громче и уверенно, как настоящие ученые. Кем вы являетесь?
По крайней мере, в обычной жизни ты абсолютно точно включая экран, да, ты имеешь дело с результатами действий той или иной инфраструктуры.
So she's not really accepting the thesis of Olga because you see the faucets and you can switch it off. I mean, in terms of the invisible infrastructure.
Они задумываются, когда идут какие-то переделки.
And the users usually think about infrastructure, they deal with it when they have to refurbish it.
Yeah.
In the literature on quite an extensive body of literature on redoing the city.
Yeah.
It's about restructuring the outside environment.
Yeah. Yeah.
There's also a symbolic dimension. It depends on how your heat radiators are working. They depend also to the heating payment bill. One other aspect which we studied was the cadastre of engineering networks of the city. Electronic map of all the networks. And the computer center engineers are trying to do with it. But the book doesn't have this story of the cadastre finished because it was very hard to find sociological literature which could serve as a model for describing this cadastre construction. And when we were doing our field work, it was not finished by the city officials.
А зачем нужно давать права нечеловечеству?
Why, putting non-humans to right?
Я
Why would you?
поясню свой вопрос. С нами мать, который работал, был такой математик, известный Суперман, который боролся с советской властью с последующим полом. Мы все находимся, вступаем в брак, а закон о праве на брак нет.
Well, basically, during the Soviet days, there was a mathematician in my department called Superman, and Superman wanted to assault the Soviet power in the following way. He basically said to the authorities, why are we all marrying when we don't have the right to marry inscribed in law?
Well,
And I don't know who won, the Soviet authorities or Superman. And I'm saying to my students, why don't you write law on the right to sleep? And why should we? Because we sleep anyway.
yeah, well, I wouldn't like to put the, can I answer this? I wouldn't like to put the influence of Bruno Latour as anything like that of the Soviet state. But, I mean, the reason to write the paper, putting the non-humans to right, is to think seriously about the role of non-humans in this sort of work. And my take on the issue was that this symmetrical principle was incorrect. And it was interesting to me, I mean, basically a point made by Andy Pickering, that most of the actual studies done by Latour students or in that actor network mode don't actually take these non-humans very seriously at all, even though there's this formal point of symmetry. So it seemed to me that it was worth tackling this issue. So the reason to write the paper was to think a bit more about these non-humans. How does another approach like social construction of technology, which clearly has non-humans in it as well as about technology, how should we deal with what Bruno and Michel have been saying? So it was an attempt to try and engage with what they were saying, and implicitly with all these millions of ant studies that are out there. I mean, there's no doubt about it that the dominant approach in our field, I think we should say this, and I think Victor was at a conference recently, is the actor network theory approach. I was just at a meeting in Berlin, not in Berlin, in Bonn, and Scott Lash, who's a very prominent British sociologist, told me that basically the whole of British sociology has been taken over now by actor network theory. That was his take on it. So this is an approach that is enormously dominant in the wider field of sociology, my kind of home discipline. And in some ways that's good. In the old days, when before Bruno Latour was well known and was sleeping on his bench and people would be talking about on my couch, and people would be talking about Michel Foucault, I used to tell my students in sociology at York, if you want someone interesting, study Bruno Latour's work. It's going to be way more interesting for you. And but it's now taken over. So this is, I think someone asked the question this morning, what about David Bloor and anti-Latour? And my feeling was the same that I have with this. Of course, too little, too late. David Bloor should have written that paper much earlier for it to have any impact. And this is probably also, you know, Bruno is such a famous guy, doesn't even have to read it now. He can blow it off to his grad students. So this is, I'm just trying to think, that's why I'm writing it. That's why I think it's an important issue for me to try and put it to right and to think about it for my own approach in social construction of technology. Yeah. Yeah.
Высказывание по-английски, да, как раз мы с вашим коллегой обсуждали до того, как пошел семинар, как перевести название. Тезис не про то, что нужно дать права вещам, как дали когда-то права человеку. Его идея, то есть переводить, видимо, как я понял из изложения, что просто надо замечать вещи, и как раз латуровская версия признания вещей как равноправных агентов, акторов или актантов, как он называет действия, как раз не устраивает. Он как раз не разделяет такой радикальной позиции, что нужно микробам приписывать такую же акторскую роль, как и людям, которые проверки в экспериментах. То есть как раз поэтому он пытался сейчас сказать, что его задача, это вот выражение putting non-humans to rights, означало, что просто не только их дать им права, но right также означает правильно их типа описать. Давайте их правильно опишем. Их роль, это явно не по-латуровски с точки зрения Тревора, так как обычно они были друзья, и он на латуру не погружался. А вот тут, соответственно, сейчас поднял топор. Okay, I explained how I thought I could fit you into...
Okay. Thank you.
So we have Olga, we have Evgenia, Anna was there, and then Nikolai wanted to have a question. So let's start with Evgenia. Okay. Ольга.
Я просто хотела попытаться ответить на вопрос Олега. Дело в том, что на самом деле способность к действию вещей в нашем исследовании тоже всплыла.
In our study we also have the capacity of things to act. But I'm not a follower of Latour as well. But the conception of the symmetry is working when you take a longitudinal approach. First you construct the pipework, for example, and then the pipework corresponds to humans. So if you take a longitudinal approach, you see that there's an interaction between the two and the symmetry exists to a certain extent. That's not really a conception of Latour because there's interaction.
Сегодня есть предположение, что вещи, они вне нас, нечеловеческие. У нас же есть, так сказать, там мир разные части.
You think that these things are outside of ours?
Вегетативные системы.
There's something like a vegetative system in our bodies, somatic stuff, and then there's things outside.
Все, так сказать, все нечеловеческое ношу с собой, так сказать, в себе.
But he thinks that actually all the non-humans are attached or included into the personality to some extent. Okay.
Нас больше интересовала способность вещи определять человеческого поведения и, может быть, даже человеческую идентичность. И пример, который у нас сразу...
We were more interested in how things structure the human identity. For example, the system of heat supply in the Soviet days.
Построено по определенным принципам коллективизма.
It was created to embody the principles of collectivism.
Очень много примеров там.
And there are many examples.
И то, как затем вот эта технология, появившаяся в советское время, стала определять практики взаимодействия людей. То, как они общались друг с другом.
Okay. And how the ontology, which was embodied in the systems in the Soviet days, is still important for interaction right now, if I got it right. Давайте перейдем к вопросам к Тревору, если можно. С фондом поговорите. Не, у нас есть очередь. Там есть Анна. Давайте сначала Николая спросим, потому что он ходил.
What are advantages of this approach to turn an infrastructure visible? Because we have, and every city have structures, engineers who works with infrastructure. We are just users, and we have interface in it. And what are the advantages of this approach who extend the rights of users to infrastructure? Why users have to go behind the infrastructure, behind the interface? I'm sorry.
Thank you. If I'm understanding you correct, the role of users in infrastructure and what see, in the Forest Home case, my example, we're in a strange position because the kind of users of the infrastructure, or one significant users of the infrastructure, are actually living in the community, and the Forest Home Improvement Association is a way of making the users' interest, one group of users, not every user, of course they're people who drive through the community who are not represented there, but they're in other parts of the democratic structure. So the users are represented here through their elected officials, okay, or they can come to meetings. Many of these things are held in public, and the actual people in the village or people outside it could also come and make their viewpoint, and did. So the users are there. So the interaction, this is a site where there's an interaction between the users and their elected officials and these normal invisible work of the engineers, who are constantly, of course, you know, working on the infrastructure. But this is a case where, as I think as Olga said, when there's two situations when you can study infrastructure that I know. Once when it breaks down, and secondly when you're doing something new. And when you're doing something new, for sure, you're going to have to get, well, I don't know if it's true in Russia, but in these American contexts, you need to get, you know, the democratic agencies, the city you have to negotiate with. There's a set of pre-existing interests you have to deal with and negotiate with, and a process for doing so. And it sounds incredibly boring. They're planning meetings, essentially. Most cities have these planning meetings. And my point is that this is the research site where what looks like boring, STS is actually being done. People are discussing, you know, how does materiality affect humans in this very context. So it's a sort of like a research site to look at this. This is what my observation was.
Okay, so Anna now.
Yeah. Is that? I hope that's clear. Was that okay?
Yeah.
Yeah. In terms of.
Nikolai, did you get it? Or you
Yeah. Yeah. But I mean, just could I just add one more thing on users? I think what would be really interesting would be to see how users appropriate infrastructure. So you can imagine, I was thinking of Madalena Krischer's early work on these electrical meters in Senegal, and how the users had appropriated the meter and basically found a way of circumventing it. So how users themselves deal with infrastructure to, you know, not pay for things, so it'd be an economic circumvention, not to pay for something with this meter, is another interesting topic to look at, because users probably are going to be very creative in the way that they deal with the infrastructure as it faces them. Now obviously it won't be probably out in a public space, it's probably going to be more in the private space of the home that they're doing some of this work. But that would be a really great research topic as well.
Is it electric calculator meters?
Yeah, so there's a meter that does some sort of electrical calculation, and there's a way of circumventing those meters. And I bet you the infrastructure in Russia, I mean, it must be the same every country. People have ways of doing this, users. It's a hidden practice, but studying that would be really interesting as well.
Имеется в виду работа Мадлен Экрич, как мы обычно называем, по-французски она оказывается Мадлен Акрич. Соответственно, про то, как в Сенегале ребята придумали, как законтачить электросчетчики, чтобы не платить. Ну, известная практика и России тоже. Тревор предлагает повторить подобные исследования юзеров сейчас. Okay, so we'll finally transfer to one.
I think I have a theoretical question. I was trying to explain your theory for our students earlier, but now I think I'm a little confused because after your presentation, I'm not sure that I understand clearly the difference between your sociology of this is STS theory or this is classical sociology, Durkheimian style. I'm not sure.
What style? Sorry, I missed it.
Durkheimian.
Durkheimian. Oh, yeah.
What the difference? Because you don't share, I think, one of the main principles, like symmetry. I don't understand.
So, well, I'm not accepting. First of all, the main principle of symmetry, we use the word symmetry, for me is the symmetry of the sociology of scientific knowledge established by Bloor. So whenever I refer to symmetry, I subscribe to that symmetrical principle, that we treat successful and failed claims in the same way. We don't evoke one sort of sociological explanation for success, another one for failure. That sort of symmetry. The symmetry I'm objecting to is that the human and the non-human should be treated the same way. So if you break that, it's still a radical program. Bloor's program is incredibly radical. The sociology of scientific knowledge, or the social construction of technology, is a radical program. And we're still dealing with the non-human, the materiality. It's saying to sociologists that you need to treat materiality seriously. It's also, by the way, going some ways towards granting that non-humans introduce new things into the world. My example of the synthesizer is an obvious case of this, that you couldn't listen to electronic music. It's a new thing in the world. This makes sort of Andy's point of becoming. New stuff happens in the world, emergence happens. And electronic music is a new phenomenon that couldn't be done until you had electronics. So something new has come into the world. So I'm not saying that they're not new things coming into the world either. I'm trying to work out what's the appropriate way to deal with this, the non-human side. And it's a more, it's an approach that is radical in the Bloorian sense, but it's not radical. And I kind of agree with Collins. I think that Andy's smiling at this, that in fact the Lectorian move is actually a rather conservative move. Because ultimately, who decides the properties of the non-humans? It's scientists. There's a danger that you'll start to evoke realist scientific explanations again if you give too much role to the non-humans. And that could be one theory about why Lector's been so successful. I don't know. But I hope it's still radical. Sorry.
We can ask actually Oleg.
It's not as radical as Steve Woolgar's approach, of course, but there's this game played. Who's got the more radical approach for it?
We'll ask Oleg Denisovetsky, who I think is a pretty good example of radical philosophy.
Yeah.
There's no
Почему, собственно, нечеловеческое непременно материальное? Столь же нечеловеческое идеальное. Вот пространство, оно человеческая вещь и нечеловеческая. А время? И т.д. какое? Почему все время так вниз смотрим, когда говорим нечеловеческое? Там похлеще есть нечеловеческие вещи.
Why do we relate inhuman things to materiality? There are things like time and space, that have nothing to do with materiality at all.
What? Sir?
There are cities and substances like time, for instance, space, or ether, for instance, and a whole bunch of other things that are not material. So why is it that inhuman, when we speak about inhuman, we relate it to materiality? It shouldn't necessarily be that way.
Not inhuman, non-human. Right?
Non-human,
Yeah. I think I may be misunderstanding the question here, because for me, the key things about time and space are that they are part of materiality. And if you read something like Peter Gallison's book on a new take on Einstein's theory of relativity, he'll talk about a key moment is how synchronized clocks in Swiss railway stations, an important ingredient to Einstein's thinking about special relativity. So it seems that time is instantiated in materiality with watches and clocks all the time, other material things, just to take the example of time. So I think I'm objecting to this idea that somehow time is independent, the premise of materiality. I may be misunderstanding the question. You may not have meant that.
Ну, имеется в виду, что специальная теория относительности Эйнштейна была сконструирована, когда Эйнштейн увидел синхронизированные часы.
Меня очень как-то удивляет мистификация слова конструирования, потому что соответствующий термин, Шеллинга, например, и до того, означал, между прочим, просто воображение, как таковое.
So I'm surprised with the mystification of the word construction, because before Schelling, or with Schelling himself, construction meant basically the capacity for imagination. Schelling, the idealist German philosopher.
Yeah. Well, the version of construction in social construction of technology, if you want to trace the lineage, it would be more through Schutz and the philosopher Schutz, through Thomas Luckman, who wrote this important book, The Social Construction of Reality. I think it was published in 1966. And of course the history of construction and constructivism is now an incredibly contested term. When someone says, I'm a constructivist, it means all sorts of different things in different sorts of academic discourses. In education theory, I've discovered it means something very different. So there's quite a good early article by Sergio Sismondo, a philosopher, tracing this lineage of the social construction as it's used in social construction of science and social construction of technology. And I think if you're looking for a genealogy, a lineage, I'd go back to Berger and Luckman and Schutz is where this sort of constructivism is coming from.
And the German term Aufbau, right? And there was Russian constructivism here in the 20s.
Yes, of course.
Which was more radical than any Luhmann's.
Yes, rather. Well, that's another different form of constructivism. Yeah, but it's certainly not just it's not imagination. It's in material practices as well. I think this is how social construction of reality was thought about, or in law as well.
Andy had a point.
Ruled. Yeah.
Andy, what's your point? You're not a constructivist, right?
I just wanted to ask you a simple question, really.
Oh, God.
Yeah.
I hate simple questions. It's usually got deep.
I mean, you started off by saying that your research is driven by curiosity. Your curiosity has a certain kind of structure, doesn't it? You're curious about things that seem to produce a kind of phenomena that traditional sociology can handle. So the simple question is, I know it wasn't very clear this afternoon, but I had a load of examples that seemed to me to point to a symmetry at the level of performance between humans and non-humans. So there's the little study of the bubble chamber. I try and show them the laser is reacting to what the bubble chamber does as well as vice versa. And if we talked about the other paper that I sent along, I was talking about the Mississippi River. Certainly people make political decisions about it, but what's interesting is that the river is continually doing things to the people. So the engineers try and fix it in place, and the river floods and washes everything away, and the human beings come back, and the whole thing kind of evolves in an emergent fashion. I could give you an endless list of cases like that.
Take the Mississippi. Can I just respond on the Mississippi River example? So, the river is trying to do something in your terminology, right? But humans are deciding where this river should be, right? That's always the water flows, but pipes are basically things that humans force water to do different things, right?
Well, they try and force the water to do things. They've been doing it for 150 years, and they keep failing, actually. The Mississippi is always flooding. I wrote this paper before Hurricane Katrina, and New Orleans was almost demolished while the paper was in print. It seems like a kind of symmetrical struggle to me between the water and the engineer. Dance of agents.
Yeah, what I found puzzling is that why you think it's always going to fail, because you could say that pipes and the fact we can go to our hotel room and switch on the tap, and most cases it works, is an example of success. I mean, do you take it that from that we should wrap up plumbing? No, we should have no more plumbing because it's inevitably going to fail?
Did I say that?
Okay. Well, there seemed to be an ontology of failure, sort of somehow an essence of failure behind the water will somehow triumph over the humans.
I call it a dance of agency. It's a reciprocal. The river reacts to what the humans do, and the humans react to what the river does.
We can continue this debate. Can I be really, since he's a fellow master, he's not supposed to ask questions. I very politely didn't ask her. So this entitles me, just to show the good fun we have in our field, to use the example that I used in my review of Andy's book, the first book, The Mangle of Practice, his second book, his first book on mangling though, where I gave the example of this dance of agency of my daughter, who was then, I think, 3 years old, struggle to put on her socks. And how there was an accommodation between her feet and the sock, and it was the dance of agency, beautifully revealed, I thought. But the point of the example was to try and say, yeah, sure, but so what?
That's the question coming from Oleg right now. So,
да, почему симметрия, а не просто сходство? Потому что симметрия имеет смысл говорить, когда есть асимметрия.
why is it symmetry and not just similarity? Because you can talk about symmetry when there's an axis, when you have an axis around or a point of symmetry.
Well, I think the idea originally in symmetry was that you have one thing over here in Bloor's symmetry and another thing over here was to make them similar, like you could think of it like a balance, you know, to do it the same. If you think of an axis, to have the same sort of explanation for what you have over here as you have over here, and that's the same idea for the human and the non-human. So the sorts of explanations you use for the human, you want to have for the non-human. So it was that idea of symmetry that was used there. It is like similarity, yeah.
So this is a metaphor, right?
Yeah, it's a metaphor, yeah. It's a metaphor, yeah.
Okay. Victor had a question. Or a statement.
May I ask you to show on the slide the roof and community of Los Angeles? Yes.
This one?
Yes, this one.
Yeah.
I'm intrigued by relation. Sorry if my question is more scholastic.
Yeah.
Victor, before we go into that, where's the Santa Monica Bay? Where's the sea here?
Yeah, well this shows you, this is an interesting question in mapping.
Because it's not...
It's out there.
Yeah.
Over there.
I don't know, if anybody knows the geography of this area better than me, you could put more in.
Okay.
This is the one I downloaded from...
Yes, sorry, Victor.
Yes, sorry. So my question is more scholastic one. I was intrigued by the relation between object and infrastructure. Because this kind of relation between object and infrastructure is supposed to be somehow explicitly conceptualized, because otherwise we're using our hidden metaphors to describe it. The easiest way is to say that object is something that has agency, like this microphone, for example, and infrastructure is all hidden hinterland that allows us to work. So it's more like an agent and limits the possibility of agency. So infrastructure becoming more and more vague term, because we start to apply it for everything, including all microphones in the room, interpreters equipment, and even maybe some plans and situation actions that if you remember the discussion. So my question is about, is infrastructure an object itself? How can we understand this framing move between when infrastructure is becoming an object? And what kind of assemblage is needed to create a new active agent out of something heterogeneous called infrastructure? Because this maybe is a good example. This Hebrew word here is yahdut, which means unity.
Yeah.
So the Hebrew word in this map tells that a roof creates a new type of entity, Jewish community. Because this is a clear visual metaphor that relations between object and the infrastructure is not relations with the current background. It's more like creating a new entity by some kind of assemblage, framing, something that takes together all elements of this hinterland and makes a new subject appear. Thank you.
No, I think this is a very interesting question. I don't think in my thinking about this, I've given enough attention to that issue, but here's my first, I'm going to try and think about it. I think I wouldn't want to make a distinction between the sorts of agency you grant individual objects and the objects that make up infrastructure, say in this case the individual telegraph poles versus this. I think obviously new capacities develop when you arrange things in networks. That's obviously another aspect of this. But I think one of the things that's going on and why the planning meetings are kind of interesting is that they're using instantiations of a little piece of this wider network to somehow focus the discussion. So this is the interesting thing. It's not that they do. Sometimes other aspects of the network will come into discussion. You know, if it's a network of infrastructure and linkages, but just as the sort of planning meeting, it's like a kind of like a laboratory. And what it tries to do is kind of isolate the infrastructure into a manageable form with very concrete objects, which then get discussed and demonstrated and tested. So, for instance, here's a nice example of this. This cobbled roadway. The people who are in favor of it devised a test site for us to go out and ride our bicycles over this little bit of cobbled railway to see the force of it. And so there, it was only a tiny little stretch of it. So here, the object itself is much smaller than the wider infrastructure. So I'm thinking on my feet about this, but I would want some way, it would involve some process of rendering this wider interconnectivity or the infrastructure that's beyond the particular site to this site and how it's dealt with. But I wouldn't want to make a radical disjunction. I think it's a very interesting question to push on for infrastructure studies. This is exactly this sort of topic we should be thinking about. Yeah.
Well, you know, I looked up, I asked Victor about where this sea was, because Victor usually knows everything. Thank God he doesn't know Los Angeles.
So where is the sea?
I can tell you what it is. It's encircling Hollywood.
Hollywood's in there.
It's encircling Hollywood. So the roof is there. How did you call it? Ярдут? Единство.
It's more like Afghan, yeah.
Единая Америка.
United America.
Okay. I thought that the sea was somehow over there, bordering, but okay.
So what's this what was this strange little bit here? It's obviously avoiding something over this bit.
No, it's just basically that's the freeways how they.
The freeway goes but the freeway must be going around something. I don't know.
So Santa Monica freeway is almost parallel to the seashore, but.
So if I may add a little bit, this kind of uniting is very consequential. It's supposed to have consequences, and I suppose that after you made a roof, you are supposed to put mezuzot, small boxes with the Jewish prayings on those telegraph. Because now, as soon as you framed it as a walls, invisible walls, the space between telegraphs is a door, actually.
Yeah, it's a door.
There is no door, but it is a door.
Yeah, a symbolic door.
Because you created like million of doors, like 100,000 doors. And that's why you're supposed to put mezuzot on each of them.
Yeah.
Which means that now you violate federal law because now you put religious signs on state property.
Yeah, if they did, I wonder if they do put. I don't think they do put those on.
But they're supposed to, otherwise the roof doesn't work.
Well, this is another question to be investigated.
So Victor comes as a rabbi fan.
Yeah.
Those things.
Yeah.
You have to develop to teach in a Russian university, you know?
Yeah.
Okay. More questions, please. Oh,
yes.
You're finally, okay, you got it.
I have a question about the role of political in this process of giving voice to thinking.
Yeah.
I mean, comparison is his idea of parliament of thinking. What do you think? Is it possible to combine on a specific political side representatives of different entities like human, non-human, objects as a new kind of political representation? Or, or we need continuation of this practice of liberal tradition of the construction of political. I mean, you have human rights, you have representatives like human rights organization, activists and so on. Now you have animal rights, and you have a huge Petersburg as well, number of animal rights activists who claimed a right to be a representative of animals.
Yeah.
And I experienced such a huge discussion with such type of activism.
Yeah.
I proposed the idea that we need to go to idea of parliament of things. In German, parliament der Dinge, so parliament of things. But the question is how it's possible to combine on particular political field or side different entities like human, maybe representatives, political activists, non-human as objects of protection or struggling for rights. So, what do you think of new forms of political in this case?
Yeah, well, I have different reactions to this. One thing is, I don't think Bruno Latour's, I went to a recent lecture of his last year where he was actually talking about this very issue, and he talked about what we need is a new way of humans and non-humans working together. We want a composition. He doesn't have very firm ideas about this Parliament of things himself. I mean, it's more like a metaphor, I think, this Parliament. And I'm not a political theorist, so, and I don't have, such strong views on the role of the non-human, so it's not incumbent upon me to come up with new political process. I have to say that the political process that we had in Forest Home worked pretty good. I mean, I have no strong objections to this sort of participant democracy over this issue, but we are a very strange community because most people in the community are Cornell professors and postdocs and grad students, so they're pretty, it's a strange community to reach political decisions anyway. But there is, we need something provocative to stir the discussion. If Harry Collins was here, who in his early debates with Latour would always do this demonstration of the difference between humans and non-humans in terms of an ethical demonstration, and I don't know if Andy's seen him do this. He'd get a pencil, he'd take a pencil, he'd say, ask for a pencil from the audience, and he'd break the pencil in front of everybody. I see him do this in a debate with Hubert Dreyfus, and he said, there's the difference between the human and the non-human. If I did that with a human here, you wouldn't let me do it. So, I mean, he's capturing, obviously, trees have rights in certain situations. That's a very interesting debate. And animal rights, these are shiftings of the boundaries. But I'm not certain we have to have a whole complete radical rethink here. That would be my take on it. Sorry. I don't think Bruno has the answer either when it comes down to this composition metaphor. It's all a bit loose and, yeah.
I had a question to you, and I'm not giving you only 10 minutes for that. I'm giving you 35 minutes, sorry, actually 20 minutes left, rather than 10 minutes left. And I know my practical question is, you so far suggested that we study infrastructure, and Olga and Evgeny immediately started to remember their books and thinking about new research. But what other types of research you could offer to students as promising topics, given the fact that you were here 10 years ago in one of the first schools which Alexander was organizing, and you are here twice in the last couple of years. You know a lot about Russian infrastructure. What would be a good research of relevance?
This is the question I was dreading. I knew you were going to ask me because you asked everybody else. Because I'm a real tourist to this city. I mean, I'll tell you the most amazing thing that when Peter Gallis and I were here, here's something that was amazing. We all had to stay on a ship. This was in, I think it was 96 we had this meeting, and there was no hotel in Petersburg that was considered fit to have foreigners in it. And there was
a Marriott hotel on a boat?
There was a Swiss hotel on a ship in the river, and we were on this ship. It was the only place they could put us. And of course, this society had been devastated. There were many, many poor people, and we were. I remember one extraordinary event. This is something again that we talked about for years afterwards. That on our way, we were into the presentations were in the Petersburg Academy of Science. So I can't remember where this ship was, but on the walk there, we passed this roundabout where there was one of these old former Soviet cars broken down on the roundabout, and the guys were actually in the car, camping in the car. So all sorts of basic infrastructure of how you repair cars had failed. They had to repair this car themselves, and they couldn't leave it at night because somebody would have stolen it. They were kind of living in this car for 3 days. We watched the progress. We sort of joked with them as we walked past about what progress they were making on this car. And then finally it was repaired, we assume, and vanished.
It was stolen. Okay.
So, but I think that there are going to be, but I would, frankly, I think it's sort of arrogant in a way as a person coming in here just for 2 or 3 days to the people who I already talked with one of the grad students here. I don't know if that grad student was here about radio, And this was in terms of sound studies. I think important part of the infrastructure is of sound. And something about, is that student who talked with Russian radios here? No, was talking, had a project looking about sound and differences in the way that the particular Russian radios were. This was in an earlier period, but so you've got a rapid change you've got a failure of infrastructure slowly coming back, and maybe I need to be here longer. This visit has been so quick. You know, I came off what was my visit like this time? I came off the plane to the cab, to the hotel, to here. It really wasn't enough to reflect on.
But that's the point. Right now, the infrastructure is quick in this country, so we should study the quickness of infrastructure.
I mean, Steve's right about the traffic, but it's hard to compare. You know, I didn't luckily get involved in any road accidents, so I don't know if I passed this intersection where everybody's crashing into each other.
Let's go then into the global things. In a sense, what about the social construction of a laboratory infrastructure? Are there? I'm not saying about lessons for Skolkovo, which is an obvious question, but if you're not ready to address it, we can skip it and we'll just look at the literature. But are there kind of literature which juxtaposes your SCOT phase to your infrastructure phase in your development?
Yeah, well, laboratories of infrastructure would be like the one Ben Sims, there's an article in Social Studies of Science, who studied an organization called Transcals, which deals with, I think that's the word, with the organization, which deals with earthquakes in California. And so it's a seismography laboratory, so it's testing of infrastructure, road transport infrastructure in case of earthquake. So there are places where infrastructure, you know, specific laboratories where aspects of infrastructure are tested. That was a really dramatic example of them because attention was put on it after the San Francisco 1989 earthquake, where the Nimitz freeway in California had failed. And so people became interested in exactly the seismographic wave, whether it was one sort versus another that had managed to damage this freeway that was supposed to be earthquake proof. So that revealed for the first time there were laboratories where this infrastructure was being investigated. And it's hard to I don't know whether the electrical utility has its laboratory set up here. It has special laboratory places, so you can imagine doing a laboratory study of those sorts of locations.
You mean of the utility company which produces electricity, right?
Yeah.
Or something else, or of the labs themselves.
The actual engineering organization, or are there mandated places where this infrastructure is tested would be the equivalent of laboratories for infrastructure. But my tendency would be to do rather what you did already, would be to follow. I think it's interesting to look at users and to, you know, try and find out with ethnographic investigation how people are actually dealing with the infrastructure here, and do comparisons of places where infrastructure has been rebuilt versus ones that it's clearly still failing. I don't know if that's the case. There must be places where it's failing still.
It's most failing.
Most failing.
It hasn't been rebuilt most.
A catalogue of what counts as infrastructure.
Last slide discussion about the radio freedom, Radio Svoboda. Was it that radio example of the radio as infrastructure?
No, it wasn't. It was something. It was to do with noise in Russian radio. As I recall, I was talking with a grad student about it. I've forgotten. So much has happened. I've blanked exactly on the project it was.
Maybe the new radio stations have new noise cultures. Like remember, Europa Plus was the only one which was kind of distinct by its sound in 1991. Right now you have many of these, and they have all kind of differentiate. But this is very important, I think.
Here's a fascinating study that in our book on sound studies, Andreas Fickers, who's a media studies guy from the University of Maastricht, did a wonderful paper on the radio dial, and this is the Western radio dial. And you know, Andy will remember this. As a kid, the radio dial used to be iconic in the 1950s, and you'd see places like Hilversum, Holland, in the middle of the radio dial. And what his paper was about was the link between the developments in radio, the the nature of this dial as a haptic field, so it's a field to it for tuning, a visual rendition, and a kind of a thing about globalization, because this is often for people in the 1950s, their first introduction to other countries through the media of radio. And he was investigating, why is it that you have these different particular sites, and it depends upon how the spectrum is allocated. And he went to negotiations, different political negotiations between organizations for packaging out the spectra, which is done in international organizations, to why certain countries have certain rights to have radio stations and so on. And it was amazing how this simple artifact, the radio dial, kind of dissolved into this complex global negotiations. I thought it was, and one could imagine, you know, that there's all interesting ways of opening up. This was an artifact linked to an infrastructure of radio. There must be interesting ways of doing this from, you know, the perspective of your country as well.
Cool. One suggestion. Before actually we finish, which is like 12 minutes left, I wanted to ask a question to Oleg Alexeyev, and I'll do that in Russian, I'll translate. Because why I'm doing this, because yesterday you said that before the infrastructure of Skolkovo is solidified, it would be great to have at least some debates on the design, and there should be a feedback before it's all kind of buried in stone and metal and millions of dollars of investment.
Yeah, absolutely.
So my question is, вопрос, Олег, а вот это бюро, которое получает Прицерские премии, которые планируют, они к инфраструктуре относятся так-то традиционно, то есть трубы должны быть не видны, провода, или они как центр Помпиду, да, в Париже, все будет, так сказать, снаружи, и составлять как раз главное внимание проходящего. Там в набросках как это все выглядит. Вы нам показали в презентации одну картинку, там было ясно, что там только можно гулять ногами, и велосипедами ездить, да, автомобилей не будет. А инфраструктура там была традиционно представлена, как подземная. Вот. Про этот разговор был. So the question is whether the infrastructure is hidden in Skolkovo blueprints right now, or whether it's visible like in the Centre Pompidou in Paris.
Честно говоря, не знаю, какое решение принято по инженерной инфраструктуре. Мне кажется, что этот вопрос еще обсуждается.
I think we're still discussing the question. I don't remember it exactly.
А что касается вот обсуждения, конечно, обсуждение можно привести вопрос к схеме.
And the discussion, of course, we need it, but with whom we will discuss, that's another question. Well, I know one guy, я знаю одного человека, who is at least.
Я имею в виду школу.
Right, Skolkovo, that's another question. And I think, я думаю, тоже надо разграничить все-таки инфраструктуру лабораторий так, чтобы, вот то, что вчера говорили про Джобса, да, чтобы было постоянное слияние, пересечение различных информационных потоков. И другое, инфраструктуру города в целом. Или если только вы не сделаете вместо города сада город лаб, город лаборатории. Это самое. I said that one should distinguish between maybe the infrastructure of labs and the infrastructure of the city, unless you're building the city lab.
Yeah.
The city/lab. Something.
Yeah. Definitely, yeah.
Okay, and more questions or statements? Well,
Well, I can just throw out something,
yeah.
just on performativity. That if I ever write this book on social construction of technology, where I try and put things together, I will have a notion of performativity there. So I think performances are important, but I think that people like Goffman and a material reading of Goffman can tell us lots about, if you go back to Goffman's original work, you find materiality there in these distinctions between front stage and backstage. In his original discussion, you find discussions of radio. He was very interested in radio and materials that allowed sound to pass through or not pass through and sight to. So a glass wall in a radio studio allowed light to pass through but not sound, while beaver boards in American offices allow sound to pass through but not sight. So he was thinking quite a lot about how interaction was staged and mediated by different materials. And I think in this infrastructural project, one of the most important things is going to be interactions between different groups of if you want to have multidisciplinary collaboration. And this is the thing that I think Steve Jobs was so clever about in designing this Apple campus. That might be a model to look at how he designed this new Apple campus, because he wanted to avoid the problem in many tech companies of hierarchy setting in. So and I think you can start to theorize and think about this in terms of STS. I'm certain Jobs was just doing it kind of intuitively, he wasn't using Goffman. But to start to think about what sort of interactions you want to encourage, which ones, going back to Sharon Trout, you want to discourage, and actually thinking about the sorts of materials, how sound will travel, what lines of vision there'll be. It becomes a very complicated discussion with architects and so on. But I think really with hope something like this would happen, because I think it could be absolutely crucial for the success of this project. And you'll curse it if you realize in 10 years' time, oh my God, we're stuck with this, and we didn't think about it back then.
Well, I think that what Trevor is suggesting was the famous work of an American sociologist, Erwin Goffman, which structured the space into front office and back office. And what is presented in the front office is completely different from what's going on backstage. But what I think, what we found at the 2 days of discussion is in the fieldwork of Vincent, the main creativity in the bank is not in the front office and it's not in the back office. It's in the middle office. Because front office sells financial instruments to clients. Back office earns money. And in between the two guys who are structured, front office is about sales, so they're structured, and the back office is about earning money somehow to satisfy the clients. They're also structured by rules. In between, there's this creative milieu, which is basically to invent how to make the two ends meet, particularly when there's a radical change in the markets and suddenly all of your promises should be sent down the drain. And so the middle office is where you have most creativity. And then this would entail that actually Skolkovo should consist of more spaces for middle offices rather than back offices or front offices. So it should be a constellation of middle offices. That's where all creativity happens. And maybe horizontally linked middle offices of different businesses. Or that would be a play on your initial method.
Well, at least we should be discussing that sort of exact issue, whether that's the right solution, because it seemed that Jobs in Apple University, he thought the space where people could meet, so they would do their real work, not their real work, they'd do some work in their separate little design studios or marketing departments, then they'd meet in between, and those sort of conversations where they were passing would be the absolute crucial ones. And there'd be space that this passing conversation would become a substantial conversation. It's no more than a famous idea about the Cavendish Laboratory, isn't it? The Cavendish Laboratory would have this space where the scientists could talk about the experiments they were running. It turned out to be absolutely crucial.
And they would talk over a cup of coffee?
Yeah, exactly. But working out those sorts of things people tend to undervalue, but it can be really crucial in a creative process. There's unexpected links between people. And
yeah.
I didn't read the biography of Jobs, but was adaptability one of the central features of the building when you actually designed or thought about it? Or did you have, because when you think of Jobs, you don't think of someone who would actually be considering adaptability or revising something after the fact. So the reason why I'm asking that, because all the questions, all the talk about designing a video that would adapt to new ways of doing things, new generations of scholars, new disciplines, being brought in, the new campus, the new city. It really strikes me, because at MIT, the new media lab is all about something that talks to that question, and that talks to the Goffman question. It is pushing to the extreme the idea that the back offices, or rather, the place where scholars are doing the actual work, is going to be transparent, should be transparent.
Right.
Well, and it's a new building. It was inaugurated 2 or 3 years ago. And what turns out, because the idea is that you have people funding the multimedia lab, corporate funding, and they come and people are supposed to show how they work. And they come unexpected. They just show up, Sony people show up and say, so what do you do? And so the idea is that people should be able to showcase what they do whenever these guys show up. What turns out to be is that these little offices are completely glass based. They have put posters everywhere. So they have reconstituted a space of opacity. And when you talk to these guys, they say, there's just no way we can be on display 24 hours. That's not the way we work. And also, the space is all about, we are going to be able to adapt. New groups are forming, and it's not working this way. And so, the whole thing about adaptability, reminds me of the thing that Boltanski and Chiapello, they have a book on the new spirit of capitalism that you know very well. That's what about the 1960s, radicals. We want to be able to adapt. We want to get rid of the old way of doing capitalism. Hierarchy is bad. So basically, the new spirit of capitalism is basically adopting these radical views and turning that in favor of the new capitalism. And who is suffering from that? Scholars who are in their glass cells, who are on display, who are supposed to please the Sony executive who come and say, they're inventing new robots. So I'm just a bit worried about the whole talk about, it needs to be, adaptability needs to be the key word. Because there needs also to be opacity and to be space where people are left to experiment, but not for the public, or not for people who are funding, but for themselves.
But it also speaks to the flexibility of the materials, that there were posters around that they could use to screen.
The solution is to actually get rid of posters so that they don't have.
Well, I guess then I will finish that by showing this. So you can take it to shield yourself away from unnecessary transparency. To show the example we just described. So I think in terms of the planned discussions, we're more or less exhausted, and we should thank Trevor for producing, how would I put it? That's why I use the word, an exhaustive and exhausting summary.
Good job done.
Right now we know how to produce inspiration in this building. Let's clap our hands for the last time for the series events, and let's thank the Skolkovo Foundation, which helped to bring us all together to discuss these things, particularly to the tenacity and temperance with which they faced STS during the last 2 days for the first time in their lives.
And thank you for staying to the end as well.